having to pay dearer for our electricity while we're trading with China, who has their electricity obviously subsidised with coal-fired power, and we're forced to give up our power for renewables. And yet we're going to have to buy these goods from China. And I think that's a bit hypocritical.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Ray. Welcome to another episode of the New South Wales One Nation TV. I have a very special guest with me today. He is the president of the New South Wales One Nation, and he's also running for the Paterson electorate in the next federal election, and that is Neil Turner. Thank you so much for joining me today, Neil.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. It's great to be here. I enjoy these interviews, and it's good to watch other people's on interviews too. And I think it's a great thing for One Nation, and thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great. And as I sort of mentioned to you before, I think a lot of the Australian public want to see the person behind the politician because politicians seem almost not tangible, not real. So what I'd love to start off with, if you're comfortable and you're willing, is a little bit of your background, like prior to politics, who you are, what made you Neil Turner.
Yeah, well, growing up, I lived in the Western Sydney suburb of Villawood, one of 6 kids. Father was a small businessman, and we lived there and got an apprenticeship when I was about 18 as a toolmaker. And yeah, they were all good for a young fellow. I joined the Army Reserve just not long after I began my apprenticeship, but as I was growing up, I got a girlfriend and sort of gave that up. But it was a great experience in the Army Reserve. And then I became a tradesman, and I was retrenched. From the industry I was in the white goods industry. So as you may know, Australia doesn't produce any white goods anymore. No refrigerators, washing machines, ovens, anything like that. It's all gone offshore. And that's partly my attraction for One Nation, like the decline in manufacturing. And during that time, I also joined the union, and which was, those days you sort of did that. And part of my experience was at union organisations and union organisers that were self-stated communists. And we were wanting to go on strike, and I think the quote was to the bosses in their ivory towers. However, as apprentices and tradesmen, we were well paid, and I just disagreed with like the mantra to increase wages and conditions to a point that I thought is unsustainable in Australia. So that sort of turned me a bit away from the union and that sort of left side of things back earlier on. Even though when I first went out to vote, like many people, I asked my father and I said, who do I vote for? And he said, well, Liberal parties for the businessman, Labor parties for the working man. Yep, okay, I went along with that. Because in my household, I remember seeing politicians like Tommy Wren sitting at the dinner table talking to my father and things like that. But I think times have changed since then. Politics has got a whole lot different. As I grew up, I went many jobs, and many jobs I ended up getting retrenched from because overseas, in working in the manufacturing jobs in the 80s and 90s, you were just job after job was sent offshore. And I thought this is not right. I understand some of the economics behind it, the free market, and how some other countries are better suited at manufacturing things, like I believe automobiles. Some countries are better to make automobiles in Australia with our smaller population, but that's another argument. So my thinking along that line developed until I got a job, Wagga, and lived there. I was able to sell my house in Sydney. I'm sure a lot of people in Sydney are finding the same thing now. They can sell their house in Sydney, move to a regional area and own their house. And and that's what I did, and which was good. And that's when I saw Pauline Hanson's maiden speech, and I was instantly attracted to that. I joined the local branch, and after a short while, I was invited to become branch president, and they were a lovely group of people. We got on so well. We all felt the same about things, about what Pauline said, infrastructure. And as we progressed, we also learned. Most of the people there were new to politics, and we learned, and it was a great thing. And occasionally we'd have Pauline visiting us, and I'd go, and some of us would go to AGMs and general meetings where we met a lovely bunch of people, and it was good. And then in the mid 2000s, Mark Latham came on board, the party started up again, and then Mark Latham came on board. And I've always been a fan of Mark Latham, even back in the days when he was opposition leader. I was drawn to him, and when he came on board, I was excited. I thought, this is what the One Nation Party needed. We needed more credible politicians to join us, and so I'm happier now than I've ever been with the party, and with the policies, I think, to go ahead. And I work in the coal industry, and the destruction of the coal industry in the Hunter, where I am now, I think is terrible. It's not thought out enough. Any of the things that are coming up with, like Anthony Albanese yesterday with green hydrogen, it's all too soon. I think there's a big place for coal, especially while countries like China are building more coal-fired power stations. And if we are going to have the hindrance of some of these losing our coal, or losing the cheap electricity, or having to pay dearer for our electricity while we're trading with China, who has their electricity obviously subsidised with coal-fired power, and we're forced to give up our power for renewables. And yet we're going to have to buy these goods from China. And I think that's a bit hypocritical to do that. So, yeah, I'm a big supporter of the One Nation cause, and I'm looking forward to going into this election and giving it my all.
Now, this particular election, can you tell us a little bit about when that's coming up, who you're sort of up against, and what that kind of is probably going to look like for you?
Well, I ran for Paterson in 2019. I gained 14.2% of the vote, which was pretty good. I thought I didn't have a lot of help on polling booths and that, a modest amount. We had, I was up against Meryl Swanson, Labor. She had been in for at least 2 terms previously, I think. The previous member was Bob Baldwin. He was a Liberal, but they changed the electoral boundaries to more suit the Labor Party, so he got out, and Labor Party has been in since then. My Liberal counterpart, she's a solicitor from Madawi, and that's all I know of as far as other candidates. But I think this year, 14.2% last time was a good result. I think I can achieve better this time. I think Labor might be expecting a bit of a downturn on their vote again, and I really think the Liberals might get a vote away from them as well, and hopefully it will come towards me.
Yeah, and
One Nation.
Absolutely. And so you're particularly passionate about certain areas, and you touched on them briefly when you kind of explained a little bit about your background, what got you interested in politics to sort of begin with. You mentioned the coal industry, manufacturing, and things like that. Can you kind of explain like what sort of policies with One Nation would help sort of assist your views on that, and what you want to achieve in those particular areas?
I think we've got to be mindful of the environment, the rubbish we produce, and we're getting there. But I think subsidising inefficient renewables is not the way to go. I don't think it's right to put electricity high tension wires all over the state, so we can have the state covered in wind turbines and solar panels. So I think there has to be a better way forward. It might be batteries might be the future. Some renewables may be the future too as they get better in their technology, but I don't think we're there yet. And I don't want to see the Hunter Valley lose all the jobs because of this seems like crazy push towards having to have all these renewables now. I mean, our electricity prices are double that of America. And how can we manufacture anything? How are the jobs going to be moved into the Hunter when we don't have affordable energy to be able to supply the manufacturing industry we need? And that's something we have to look at. And education in Australia is another thing. We have to really look at education like TAFE colleges. They have to be a reasonable cost so everybody can go. I was going to TAFE a few years ago and the price like doubled one semester. And I said, well, this is not right. I couldn't keep going to TAFE at the stage because of the cost. And I think we really have to lower the cost of education in Australia at TAFE for everyone, so everyone can attend, skill up, and undertake lifelong learning.
You've mentioned previously as well that you think that there should be amendments and things with the cost of living, that the cost of living in Australia is obviously quite expensive and things like that, which is, again, another important issue that a lot of Australians want to know about and, want at least politicians to understand their concerns with that because, cost of living in the cities and in pretty much anywhere is just sky high so often. But you've also mentioned as well another issue about pensioners and things like that. Is this something that you feel quite strongly about? And I guess, what are your concerns in that particular area?
Well, with pensioners, I'm with Gay on there should take it out of private hands. And I'm a bit of a socialist. I believe in Medicare. I think the government needs to take more control of the pensioners' housing, and it's be more under the umbrella of government. There has to be a reasonable cost for pensioners, and as far as the cost of living is like you said, the price to build a house is ridiculous now. I mean, that affects wages. I mean, people have to earn more money. That affects our inability to manufacture competitively. So I think we really have to look at ways, and it's a tricky one because if you start manipulating, you cause all sorts of trouble with the real estate industry. So it's a tricky one, but I think we've got to look at it so young people are able to purchase a house to live in and without breaking the bank and without having to worry about interest rates going up and they're losing everything they've got. So I think that we have to be mindful of that. There doesn't seem any effort at the moment by either parties to address that. I think it's might be too scary for them, but it's going to have to be addressed. Inflation is starting to rise now, and I think it's a bad omen on the horizon during the next electoral cycle.
Yeah, I remember my parents back in the day bought a house for $30,000, and now you can't buy a really small 3-bedroom home for under 1.5 in Sydney these days. So and the cost of building, again, like you mentioned, is super expensive. So we need politicians who are going to take these issues seriously, because you look at our kids and those generations to think, how are they ever going to afford a house and sustaining living in that house as well? So I'm glad that you sort of touched on that and you could kind of share your views on that. Just another thing that you've kind of mentioned as well that you're sort of passionate about is water. And this is obviously an important issue for a lot of Australians because of the place that we live in and all of these things. So what are your sort of views on the water situation in Australia?
Well, we've seen the Snowy Mountain scheme and how it provided water downstream into the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. And we had vast rice farms producing crops and dairy and a whole lot of things down there. And then I think it was John Howard, they privatised the water, and the water goes to the highest bidder. It's even tradable. Companies make money off it. I think that sort of system is what they introduced, I suppose, pure capitalism, needs to be addressed. I think in times of drought, yes, no, not everyone can have access to all the water they want. But I think we really have to look at some of the profiteering that goes into water, and it should be more distributed to farmers the way it was. But we need infrastructure, believe we need dams. I fully agree with the One Nation proposal to build the inland water, the Bradfield scheme in Sydney, or a modified version of it. I think if you could get water down the western side of the Great Dividing Range, a permanent river source, you could provide towns, cities out there for the population, and just open up more inland the population. I think that's a good idea. Nobody seems to want to look at it. They say they do, but I think it's a nation building plan. And our forefathers, with a very few or small population, much smaller than now, like pre the early 1900s, it was like 5 million. Yet they built so much for this country, like railways, buildings, and we've seen to move away from that. And so I think we've got to go back to doing that, providing employment for people, infrastructure, nation building projects. To if we're going to have greater population, which I don't believe we should have any more than the cap 70,000, but we seem intent on populating the cities of Australia with a lot more people without adding to infrastructure. And I think that's got to change, I think.
Definitely. It sounds very much like you want Australia to do well, and that your efforts and your concerns are with the Australian people as opposed to, elsewhere, which is a nice thing to think of, because as you said, Australia is constantly changing and growing, and a lot of the time it feels for Australians that our needs aren't necessarily met. So the fact that you're considering about jobs, infrastructure, manufacturing, you're thinking about water distribution, all these things is encouraging for Australians to hear, because it feels like they are being heard. Now, sort of before we sort of wrap it up at the end, I thought I'd give you an opportunity to talk about anything that you can think of that you may have missed out on, that you feel passionate about. And then also where people can find you. If people want to contact you and ask you maybe directly where you stand on something, or they want to support you, find out more about the One Nation policies, like where people can kind of go to do that.
Yeah, well, pretty soon my campaign launch will be this Saturday, but I will have a Facebook page up. This is Neil Turner for Paterson. I will have Gay has a Neil Turner for Paterson web page, neilturner.com.au. I hope it'll be, and people will be able to get in touch with me either of those ways, or through the One Nation webpage will also have a link to me. And I'd like to talk to anybody about everything. I mean, there's a lot of things in my views on policy that I am not 100% on, and I would love to have feedback. People might have some different ideas or some arguments against what I feel is right. I talk to everyone and listen to everyone. And I think that's the best way to do. I mean, I think you've got to have an open mind with many of these things. And I like to have an open mind about everything.
Well, thanks again for joining me today. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your background. It's very interesting. My family were tool makers by trade, and they worked for Sunbeam doing all the white goods as well, which is really interesting that you mentioned that. My brain tweaked and was like, they're from the Bankstown sort of area as well. So maybe you worked with some of my family along the way. But yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope other people reach out and talk to you as well. I hope people don't just take things on surface level. They actually contact you, find out your thoughts on things and look around. And yeah, I'm really glad that you could join me, and I thank you for sharing your views, and definitely look forward to the next episode on One Nation TV where I get to interview somebody else.